Ethan, she's not coming, and she left this note. For a moment Ethan froze. The hall was brimming with opulence. Crystal chandeliers reflected the light with an almost theatrical brilliance, while arrangements of white and gold flowers adorned every possible surface. Guests murmured among themselves, a mixture of excitement and anticipation hanging in the air. At the altar, Ethan Lockwood adjusted his collar with fingers that, to his surprise, trembled slightly. He rarely felt nervous, but the weight of that day, and the future he was about to seal, was undeniable. "What do you mean? She's not coming?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with incredulity. Lucas hesitated before holding out the note, avoiding eye contact. I don't know, man. That's all I've got." Ethan took the piece of paper, his hands now visibly shaking. Sienna's handwriting was unmistakable. Slightly slanted, elegant, and simple. "Ethan, forgive me. I can't do this. One day you'll understand. Sienna." He read the words once, twice, 3 times, as if they were a riddle he simply couldn't solve. "What? Is that it?" His voice came out louder than he intended, drawing the attention of a few people in the front rows. He looked up, searching for someone, anyone, who could explain the absurdity of the situation. "Where is she?" he demanded, turning to Lucas. The best man's expression was a mix of empathy and helplessness. "No one knows." The guests began to sense that something was wrong. The murmurs shifted into agitated whispers, heads craning for clues. Some faces showed genuine concern, while others radiated pure curiosity. Toward the back, reporters tried to capture the moment, cameras rising like vultures circling for a story. "This doesn't make sense," Ethan murmured, almost to himself. He clenched the note in his hand as if the paper might magically bring Sienna back. "Ethan, maybe it's best if you step away for now," Lucas suggested in a low but firm tone. "Step away?" Ethan turned to him, his eyes blazing with frustration. "And leave it like this? With everyone here with this?" He gestured toward the altar, the guests, the chaos about to erupt. Before Lucas could reply, the sound of a camera flash rang out, too loud. Ethan turned sharply. One overly bold press photographer had ventured too close, aiming to capture the shock on the abandoned groom's face. "Mr. Lockwood," another reporter shouted. "Is it true she ran away? Can you confirm?" Ethan felt his blood boiling. He squeezed the note tighter, crumpling it in his fingers. "That's enough," he muttered to himself. Without another word, he stepped down from the altar with firm, rapid strides, ignoring the gazes that followed him like knives. The moment he passed through the hall doors and the cold Chicago air hit him, he stopped. Outside, the silence felt even crueler. He looked at the note again, one last time, before carefully folding it and tucking it into the inside pocket of his jacket. The words were simple, but their impact reverberated like thunder. "One day you'll understand," but in that moment he understood nothing. The doors of the hall opened behind him, and Ethan heard the cacophony of voices grow louder. He knew he couldn't escape without facing what had been left behind. Journalists were outside as well, stationed behind metal barriers, eagerly awaiting any sign of movement. The limousine, parked at the main entrance, looked like a distant sanctuary, but between him and the vehicle were flashes and microphones raised like spears. "Ethan, what happened? There are rumors that Sienna ran away with another man. Do you have anything to say to the guests? Is this a blow to the Lockwood family's image?" The last question struck him harder than the others. Ethan stopped abruptly, his fists clenched. He wasn't just being abandoned as a man but exposed as a Lockwood, heir to one of Chicago's most influential families. To the world, his life had to be flawless. Today, it had become a spectacle of tragedy. Lucas appeared by his side, like a loyal shadow. "Ignore them, Ethan. Get in the car. Now." Ethan stared at the circle of journalists and flashes for a long moment. His jaw was tight, and he seemed on the verge of saying something, but the words got stuck in his throat. Without responding to anyone, he walked toward the limousine. "Mr. Lockwood, did she give any explanation?" A voice insisted from the crowd. He didn't look back. Inside the car, the silence was deafening. The door closed with a muted click, and Ethan stared ahead, his eyes fixed on nothing. Lucas slid in beside him, drawing the privacy curtain to shield them from prying eyes. "Do you want me to call someone?" Lucas asked cautiously. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He slowly loosened his tie, as if he needed more air, and rested his elbows on his knees, burying his face in his hands. "She was fine yesterday," he said finally, his voice hoarse and low. "We laughed together during the rehearsal. She was nervous, of course, but she seemed happy." He lifted his head, narrowing his eyes as if trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything had fallen apart. Lucas sighed. "Maybe it's not something you can understand right now. Maybe ever." Ethan looked up at his friend, the words echoing in his mind. Maybe ever. That wasn't an option for him. He wasn't the kind of man who accepted mysteries, especially not when the mystery involved his name, his family, and his dignity. "I want answers, Lucas," he said finally, his voice regaining the firm, controlled tone he used in business. "She can't just disappear and think that's okay. Not with this." He gestured outside, where the crowd still waited. Lucas hesitated but eventually nodded. "All right, but for now you need to lay low. We'll head straight to your penthouse. No press, no explanations. Let me handle the guests." Ethan nodded in agreement. He leaned back against the soft leather seat and closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his eyelids only intensified the whirlwind in his mind. The questions haunted him. Why? Where is she? Who else knows? The car started moving, pulling away from the chaos, but the noise of the crowd seemed to linger in his head, pulsing alongside his growing anger. When they arrived at the penthouse, Ethan hoped to find some solace in the silence and solitude of the space. But the reality of the situation hit him the moment he stepped through the door. The room was filled with reminders of the wedding that never happened. Neatly stacked gift boxes in the corner, congratulatory notes left on the entry table, a bottle of champagne on the kitchen counter. He stopped in the middle of the room, looking around as if it were a stage set for a nightmare. He shrugged off his jacket and tossed it onto the sofa, ignoring the muffled sound of fabric hitting leather. Sienna's note was still in his pocket. He pulled it out and unfolded it again, rereading the same words. It didn't make sense. None of it made sense. He grabbed his phone and, without thinking, dialed her number. He knew it was pointless, but he couldn't help himself. The call went straight to voicemail. "Sienna," he began, his voice trembling but controlled. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I don't know what happened or why you did this, but I will find out." He hung up, and there, alone in the silence of the penthouse, Ethan Lockwood realized his world had changed forever. The rain beat against the penthouse windows, tracing rhythmic, relentless streaks across the glass. Ethan sat at the dining room table, a phone in one hand and a glass of whiskey in the other. Spread before him, like pieces of an incomplete puzzle, were photographs, bank statements, and lists of calls Sienna had made in recent months. All the work of two of Chicago's top private investigators. She couldn't have just vanished, Ethan murmured to himself, flipping through a page that detailed the days leading up to the wedding. On the other end of the line, a deep voice responded, "Mr. Lockwood, the investigation was thorough. Sienna Harper hasn't used her credit cards, accessed her bank accounts, or contacted anyone we know of. It's as if she evaporated." Ethan tightened his grip on the glass, frustration building like a storm within him. "No one disappears like that. Someone knows where she is, and I want you to find them." "Understood. We'll keep trying," the detective replied before hanging up. Ethan threw the phone onto the table with a dull thud. The search had begun right after the failed wedding, but weeks of effort had yielded nothing but more doubts and questions. He had combed through every detail of his last month with Sienna. The glances they exchanged, the conversations, the moments when she seemed hesitant. Nothing pointed to her running away, let alone a complete disappearance. He stood and began pacing the room, the tension in each step reflecting the chaos in his mind. His next step was a list of mutual friends. He had already spoken to her parents, who claimed to know nothing, or at least that's what they said. He called Claire, one of Sienna's closest friends. "Claire, it's Ethan," he said bluntly, wasting no time. There was a pause on the other end. "Ethan, I don't think you should be calling me." "I'm not asking for your opinion," he snapped, his tone sharp. "I want answers. Have you seen her since the wedding? Did she talk to you? Has anyone mentioned where she might be?" "No," Claire replied, exasperated. "Ethan, I don't know anything. All I know is that she seemed nervous in the last few weeks, but she never said why. I thought it was just wedding jitters. I thought it was normal." "Nervous? What do you mean?" Ethan pressed. "She was different," Claire admitted reluctantly. "More reserved. She avoided questions about the future. I asked if everything was okay, but she brushed it off. That's all." He pinched the bridge of his nose, the frustration growing unbearable. It felt like every conversation led him back to square one. "If you remember anything else, anything at all, call me," he said before ending the call. Ethan was beginning to grasp the scope of the mystery. Sienna hadn't just disappeared. She had planned to disappear. But why? The note offered no clues. Only that cryptic, "One day you'll understand." Days turned into weeks, and Ethan's obsession only deepened. He spent small fortunes hiring more investigators and technology specialists, but they all hit the same wall. Inactive bank accounts, no airline records, no hotel bookings. And as the search dragged on, the weight of abandonment began to morph into something more corrosive. One night, while reviewing the latest report from yet another detective, Ethan paused. He found himself staring at a photo of Sienna. It was a candid shot, taken during a trip to her family's country house. She was smiling at the camera, her eyes filled with something he now recognized as a secret. "Why did you do this?" he asked aloud, as if the image might answer. But the photo remained silent, like everything else in the fruitless search. And so, Ethan Lockwood found himself trapped in a void even greater than the one left at the altar. The emptiness of not knowing. The hall was filled with voices, laughter, and the clinking of crystal glasses. The warm light from the chandeliers bathed the crowd, casting a golden glow over the tables adorned with understated floral arrangements. It was the kind of charity event Ethan attended out of obligation, not choice. He was there to represent the Lockwood name and its financial empire, a constant reminder of his place in society. Ethan leaned against one of the bar counters, holding a whiskey glass that had long lost its flavor. His public appearances had become mechanical. He smiled at the right moments, greeted the right people, and answered predictable questions about business and investments. But no one there knew that, even after 2 years, he carried an invisible weight that kept him from truly breathing. "Mr. Lockwood?" The voice beside him was light but firm. Ethan turned, expecting to see yet another familiar face from high society. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman he didn't recognize. She didn't seem intimidated by his presence. On the contrary, there was something in her gaze, a quiet, unassuming confidence. "Yes?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Sorry to interrupt," she began, holding a glass of white wine, "but you don't look like someone who's having much fun." Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the directness of her approach. It was rare for anyone to speak to him like that, especially in such a formal setting. "You think so?" "I know so." She shrugged, a small smile curving her lips. "You've got the same expression I had when I arrived. But at least I have an excuse. I'm new to these kinds of events." He studied her for a moment, intrigued. She didn't seem to be there to impress anyone. She wore a simple blue dress that, while elegant, stood out against the flashy outfits of most of the other women. Her hair was pulled back in a deliberately messy bun. "And what's your excuse?" he asked, crossing his arms. "I'm a teacher," she said, tilting her head slightly. "Literature. I was invited by one of the organizers. I think they wanted to fill a seat at the head table with someone who wouldn't throw around financial jargon no one understands." Ethan chuckled before he could stop himself. Her honesty was a breath of fresh air. He extended a hand. "Ethan Lockwood." "Grace Montgomery," she replied, shaking his hand. "But, of course, you already knew that. I bet you memorized the guest list before coming." "Not exactly," he said, smiling for the first time that night. They talked for a few minutes, and to Ethan's surprise, he found himself relaxing. Grace didn't seem interested in his wealth or the weight of the Lockwood name. She talked about books, travel, and the frustration of trying to teach Shakespeare to teenagers who were more interested in their phones. "And you? What do you do to escape all this pomp?" she asked, gesturing subtly at the room around them. Ethan hesitated, his smile fading for a brief moment. He realized he didn't have an answer. For 2 years, he had buried himself in work, social events, and an obsessive search for answers that never came. Escape hadn't been part of the equation. "Maybe I should start with that," he said finally. Grace tilted her head, intrigued. "Start with what?" "Escaping," he replied, offering no further explanation. She smiled, as if she understood more than he had said. "It's a good start." The sound of a microphone echoed through the hall, signaling the beginning of the main speeches. Grace raised her glass. "Well, it was a pleasure, Mr. Lockwood. I hope you find something interesting here besides million-dollar checks and buffet tables." She began to walk away, but Ethan called out before she got too far. "Grace." She stopped and turned to look at him. "Maybe you can help me with that." She smiled again, that calm, effortless smile that seemed to disarm him. "Who knows? Good luck, Ethan." As she disappeared into the crowd, Ethan stood still for a moment, holding his empty glass. For the first time in a long while, he felt a little less tethered to the past. Maybe he thought this really could be the start of something new. The first time Ethan invited Grace for coffee was 2 weeks after the charity event. He hesitated before sending the message, a simple suggestion to meet at a quiet cafe in downtown Chicago. It wasn't a romantic gesture, or so he told himself. It was curiosity, a desire to talk to someone who seemed uninterested in his wealth or the Lockwood name. Grace arrived punctually, carrying a book and a worn leather backpack. Ethan was already waiting at a table near the window, a nearly untouched black coffee in front of him. "I hope you're not the type who judges people based on their punctuality," Grace teased as she set the book on the table and took a seat. Ethan smiled. "Actually, I'm exactly that type of person." "Great. Then I guess I passed the test." She ordered a latte, and as the barista prepared it, she started chatting casually. Ethan noticed she had a rare talent for asking direct questions without coming across as intrusive. "So, when was the last time you read something that wasn't about finance or economics?" Grace asked, raising an eyebrow. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "That sounds like an accusation." "It's more of an educated guess." He paused, thinking. "I guess it was The Great Gatsby in college." "Not sure if that counts." "It counts," she said with a smile, "though it's a bit of a cliché. But that's okay. We'll start there." In the meetings that followed, their connection seemed to develop slowly but steadily. Grace was attentive but never overbearing. Ethan, on the other hand, wrestled with his own hesitations. He didn't allow himself to trust easily. Even though Grace was unlike anyone he had ever met, the shadow of Sienna lingered over him. On a particularly cold evening, they were sitting together on a bench in Lincoln Park. Grace was wrapped in a thick scarf, while Ethan held a coffee cup to warm his hands. "You don't talk much about the past," she said after a long, comfortable silence. Ethan remained still for a moment. He had known this conversation would come, but that didn't make him ready for it. "It's not something I like to revisit," he finally replied. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said gently. "I'm just saying you don't have to carry it all alone." Ethan turned his gaze to the bare branches of the trees, thinking about how to respond. He didn't want to burden her with the weight of what he carried. The pain, the abandonment, the frustration of unanswered questions. They were still open wounds. "I lost someone," he said at last, his voice low, in a way that didn't make sense. "And I guess I'm still trying to make sense of it." Grace nodded, not pressing him for details. "Maybe you'll never understand," she said softly. "But maybe you can move forward anyway." Her words hung in the air, resonating with a sincerity he hadn't expected. As the months passed, their casual meetings became more frequent. Grace revealed a side of herself that Ethan hadn't realized he needed. She was patient but also challenging, pushing him out of the emotional bubble he had built around himself. At the same time, Grace was cautious. Ethan noticed it in small gestures, like how she avoided talking about past relationships. One evening, as they walked after a simple dinner at an Italian restaurant, Ethan suddenly stopped and looked at her. "Why are you so careful with me?" he asked bluntly. Grace hesitated, gripping the strap of her bag a little tighter. "Because you're careful with me too," she replied with a faint smile. "It's like we're dancing around something, waiting to see who stumbles first." He didn't know what to say, but for the first time he realized she was right. They both carried their own fears and hesitations, yet they were drawing closer, even if cautiously. A month later, they shared their first kiss, unexpected yet somehow inevitable. It happened one late afternoon, as Grace was animatedly talking about a student who had finally grasped a passage from Macbeth. Ethan was simply watching her, the excitement on her face lighting up her features. "You're smiling." "Why?" she asked, interrupting herself mid-sentence. "You're different," he said before leaning in to kiss her. The kiss was brief but intense. When they pulled away, Grace looked surprised but not uncomfortable. "Well," she said with a soft laugh, "that was unexpected." "For me too," Ethan admitted. And somehow the walls they had both built around themselves began to crumble, brick by brick. The sound of dry leaves being blown by the wind was the only noise in Ethan's rooftop garden, a space he rarely used but that Grace had adopted as a refuge. She sat in a wooden chair, gazing at the Chicago skyline with a pensive expression, holding a mug of tea. Ethan appeared at the glass door, arms crossed, watching her. He noticed that, in recent days, Grace had been quieter than usual, as if carrying a secret she didn't know how to share. "Are you okay?" he asked, walking toward her. Grace looked up and forced a smile. "Yes, I am." He sat down beside her, studying her carefully. "Grace, something's bothering you. You can talk to me," she sighed, placing the mug on the table beside her. For a moment, she was silent, staring at her hands. Then, without preamble, she said, "I'm pregnant." Ethan blinked, startled. "What?" "I'm pregnant," she repeated, now looking directly at him. "I found out yesterday." A long silence followed. Ethan sat motionless, processing the news. He felt a whirlwind of emotions. Surprise, fear, but also an unexpected wave of happiness. "Are you okay with this?" she asked hesitantly. "Yes," he replied immediately without hesitation. "Yes, I am. I just wasn't expecting it." Grace smiled, relieved. "Neither was I." For a moment, they sat there, letting the weight of the revelation settle between them. Ethan reached out and covered her hand with his. "This changes everything, doesn't it?" She nodded. "It does." The decision to marry came a few weeks later during dinner at the same Italian restaurant where they'd shared their first kiss. Ethan hadn't planned a grand proposal. In fact, the idea struck him in the middle of a conversation about the house Grace was thinking of renting. "You should move in with me," he said casually. Grace looked at him, surprised. "Into your penthouse?" "Yes. It makes sense, doesn't it? We're together and now we're having a child." She hesitated, fiddling with her glass of water. "Ethan, I don't want this to just be for convenience." "It's not," he said, taking her hand. "I want you here. I want you with me, Grace." He paused, taking a deep breath. "And I want you to be my wife." She stared at him, clearly surprised. "Are you proposing to me right now?" "Yes. I know it's not the most elaborate proposal, but..." He shrugged. "It feels right." Grace laughed, a warm and spontaneous laugh he loved. "Ethan Lockwood, you're terrible at proposing." He smiled, relaxing. "Is that a yes?" She nodded, smiling. "Yes." The wedding was small. A simple ceremony in a judge's chambers with Lucas as the witness and a few close friends. There was no press, no opulence like the wedding Ethan had planned years ago. Grace had insisted on something intimate, and he agreed. After the ceremony, the three of them, Ethan, Grace, and their unborn daughter, went home together. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something within him shift, as if life was reorganizing itself to offer him a second chance. While Grace rested on the couch, her eyes closed, Ethan stood in the doorway of the living room, watching her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Sienna's note, which he still kept as a bitter reminder. For a moment, he stared at the hastily scrawled words. "One day you'll understand." And then, without much thought, he tore it in half. This time, he didn't keep the pieces. He tossed them into the trash, taking a deep breath. It wasn't an act of complete forgetfulness, but it was a step forward. He had decided to move on. After years of anger mixed with sorrow, he had found someone who helped him navigate the trauma. And there, in that sunlit room, with Grace sleeping peacefully and the soft sounds of the city in the background, Ethan felt something close to peace for the first time in a long while. The fireplace crackled gently, filling the quiet room with the comforting sound of flames consuming wood. Ethan sat in a leather armchair near the window, holding a glass of whiskey, though he'd barely taken a sip. Outside, the city lights shimmered like a sea of artificial stars, and the moon hid behind a thin layer of clouds. Grace was asleep in the bedroom, now 6 months into her pregnancy. Ethan had left her to rest after a long evening of discussing baby names. It had become a ritual he cherished. Grace, with that unique glow in her eyes, imagining their future with a calm, contented smile. But now, alone, the stillness of the night brought a different companion. The memories of Sienna. He closed his eyes, and like an unstoppable current, the flashes began. Her smile during their walks in the park, the way she absent-mindedly twirled her hair while reading a book, the laughter they shared in private moments, away from society's pressures. And then the last day, the white dress, the packed church, the note with words he still couldn't fully understand. Ethan opened his eyes quickly, trying to push the images away. Years had passed, but the void Sienna left remained a persistent echo. He had rebuilt his life. Grace was proof of that. She had brought him something he didn't realize he needed: stability, simplicity, and unpretentious love. But Sienna's shadow lingered, especially on nights like this, when the city's hum blended with the quiet stillness he carried inside. He picked up his phone and, without thinking, opened the gallery of old photos. Most were of moments with Grace and recent friends, but he scrolled further back, passing quickly through the lost years. And then, there she was, Sienna, smiling on a trip to the coast. Ethan took a deep breath, his fingers hovering over the screen before locking it again. He knew Grace had never asked him to forget Sienna. She was understanding, patient. But he also knew that holding onto those photos and memories somewhere in his mind was unfair, not just to Grace but to himself. He set the phone down on the table beside him and stood, walking to the window. The city below seemed endless, and somewhere within it, he imagined, Sienna might still exist. The thought haunted him. She had disappeared from his life but not from the world. What if she's alive? What if she has an explanation? You can't keep thinking about this, he murmured to himself, crossing his arms as he stared at the horizon. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. It wasn't something he could just erase. Sienna had been a significant part of his life, and the way she left had left deep scars. Scars Grace could never quite reach. He thought about the daughter who was on her way, about the new life he was building. That should be enough. And in many ways it was. But the night had a cruel habit of dredging up the doubts and ghosts that daylight could bury. The hospital corridor was quiet, bathed in a soft white light that reflected off the pristine walls. Ethan paced back and forth, his breathing short and his heart pounding in his chest. For all the high-stakes meetings and billion-dollar decisions he had handled, nothing had prepared him for this moment. "Mr. Lockwood?" He stopped abruptly as a nurse opened the door to the delivery room, her mask unable to hide the smile in her eyes. "You can come in now." Without hesitation, Ethan stepped through the door, feeling a chill run down his spine. The scene before him was chaotic, yet it carried a serenity he hadn't expected. Grace lay on the bed, exhausted but glowing with a radiance he had never seen before. In her arms was the reason for everything, a tiny bundle of life wrapped in a white blanket. Ethan approached slowly, his gaze fixed on Grace's face before settling on the baby. Little Lauren looked so fragile, so perfect, with her half-closed eyes and tiny hands curled into delicate fists. "Hi," Grace said with a tired smile, her eyes glistening with tears. "Come meet her." Ethan sat beside her, still in disbelief. Grace gently placed Lauren in his arms, and in that moment, something shifted. It was as if the world around him disappeared. He looked at his daughter's face, feeling a surge of emotion so intense it was almost overwhelming. For years, he had carried the weight of abandonment, uncertainty, and an endless search for answers that never came. Now, it all seemed to dissolve in the simplicity of the moment. "She's perfect," Ethan murmured, his voice low and rough. Grace smiled, watching him tenderly. "She's lucky to have you as her dad." Ethan shook his head, still looking at Lauren. "I'm the lucky one. You too. You're everything." The minutes passed like a dream. Lauren stirred softly in his arms, letting out small sounds that made him laugh for the first time in a long time, effortlessly and without hesitation. He felt something he hadn't thought possible in years. Peace. As he held his daughter, Ethan thought about everything he had lost, but also about what he had found. Sienna was still a shadow in his story, but now, in that moment, she felt distant, like a memory faded by time. Grace placed her hand over his, interrupting his thoughts. "Ethan," she said softly, "we're okay." He met her gaze, feeling the weight of those words. For the first time, he believed them. As the night unfolded, with Grace resting beside him and Lauren sleeping in his arms, Ethan realized that, despite everything, life had given him a second chance, a new family. And finally, he found something he didn't need to question: the present. Lincoln Park was at its best that spring afternoon. The sun bathed the grass in golden light as children ran toward the nearby carousel. Pigeons flapped their wings along the sidewalks, and the air was filled with the scent of popcorn and fresh pretzels. Ethan walked alongside Grace, holding Lauren's small hand. The little girl, with her golden curls and curious eyes, turned her head from side to side, enchanted by everything around her. "Look, Daddy." Lauren pointed to a group of ducks lazily swimming in the nearby pond. "They're so close. Want to feed them?" Ethan asked, already kneeling to get on her level. "Yes," Lauren said enthusiastically, looking up at Grace. "Do we have bread, Mommy?" Grace laughed, reaching for a cloth bag slung over her shoulder. "We always have bread for the ducks, my little naturalist." As Grace pulled out pieces of bread, Ethan stood and looked around. He enjoyed taking in scenes like this. Families gathered, runners rushing by, couples sitting on benches exchanging quiet smiles. It was the opposite of the rigid corporate events that dominated his life, and he had learned to cherish these moments since Grace and Lauren became part of it. But then, something caught his attention. Near a bench, slightly apart from the crowd, stood a woman in worn clothing, holding the hand of a small child. The woman seemed out of place, like a shadow that didn't belong in the sunny landscape. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and the coat she wore was visibly frayed, almost threadbare. Ethan stopped walking, his eyes fixed on her. Time seemed to slow as he tried to process what he was seeing. "Sienna," he murmured, almost inaudibly. She was thinner, her face marked by exhaustion and the evident weight of difficult years. But it was unmistakable. Sienna Harper, the woman who had disappeared from his life 5 years earlier, was standing there. Beside her, a young girl with brown hair and large eyes held her hand. The child had a timid demeanor, but there was something about her that made Ethan's heart skip a beat. He couldn't look away from the child, who seemed no older than 4. "Ethan?" Grace called, noticing he had stopped. "Is everything okay?" He didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Sienna, who seemed to avoid eye contact with anyone, focused solely on guiding the little girl toward the other side of the park. "I need to check something," he said abruptly, handing the bag of bread to Grace, trying to sound calm. "I'll be right back." Grace frowned, surprised, but nodded. "Okay, don't take too long. Lauren's going to start interrogating me if you're gone too long." Ethan managed a faint smile, but it quickly disappeared as he began walking toward Sienna. Each step felt heavy, like he was moving through a tunnel of time. When he was just a few feet away, Sienna noticed him. She lifted her gaze and their eyes met. For a moment, the world around them seemed to go silent. The sound of children playing, birds chirping, even the wind, everything went still. "Sienna," he said, his voice firm but low. She froze, gripping the little girl's hand tighter. Her expression was a mix of shock and something he couldn't quite decipher. Fear, perhaps. "Ethan," she managed to say. He looked at the child beside her, and his mind started to race. The little girl seemed uncomfortable with the tension in the air and tried to hide behind Sienna. "It's really you?" Ethan asked, his voice wavering between disbelief and restrained anger. "After all these years." "I can't do this right now," she said quickly, averting her gaze. She took a step back, pulling the child with her. "Please, Ethan. Not now." Before he could respond, she started to move away, quickening her pace. "Sienna, wait," he called, but she didn't stop. Ethan stood there, watching her disappear into the crowd at the park. His chest heaved as his mind spiraled into chaos. He looked again at where she had been. The image of the little girl burned into his memory. Her age, her face, the dates began to align in his mind like puzzle pieces falling into place. Ethan Lockwood knew this wasn't a coincidence. When he returned to Grace and Lauren, he tried to appear calm, but his mind was elsewhere. The past had resurfaced, bringing with it a mystery he could no longer ignore. A few days later, Ethan was sitting in his office, his eyes fixed on a report he was supposed to be reviewing. The pages of numbers and charts were clear, but he saw nothing. Since that day in the park, his mind had been trapped in the image of Sienna and the little girl with her. Logic told him to leave it behind. He had a life now, a life he had fought hard to rebuild with Grace and Lauren. But something about Sienna's expression, the urgency with which she had fled, refused to be ignored. When his phone vibrated on his desk, Ethan picked it up automatically, expecting a routine work notification. Instead, he saw a message from an unknown number. "Ethan, we need to talk. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Milton Cafe, downtown." He read the message twice, the words brief and to the point. There was no signature, but he knew exactly who it was from. Sienna. He gripped the phone tightly, his mind spinning. After years of silence, she was reaching out. The message was short, but it said so much. She was controlling the narrative, setting the place and time. This wasn't a request. It was an instruction. For a moment, Ethan considered ignoring it. Part of him wanted to keep his distance, to avoid reopening wounds that had barely healed. But another part of him knew he needed answers. Not just for himself, but for Lauren, for Grace, for everything he had built. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Milton Cafe a few minutes before 10 a.m. It was a small, unassuming place, tucked away from the busier parts of downtown. He chose a table in the corner, strategically positioned so he could see who entered and left. The cafe was relatively empty, with only a few scattered customers. The aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the soft clinking of cups and the gentle hum of instrumental music in the background. When the door opened, Ethan knew immediately that it was her. Sienna walked in, wearing a brown coat that seemed too large for her. Her eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on Ethan with a mix of determination and caution. She approached him, carrying a small crossbody bag. As she reached the table, Ethan stood, but she gestured for him not to bother. "Sienna," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, though the tension was evident. "Ethan," she replied, sitting across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He studied her closely, trying to read her expression. She looked worn, as if carrying a burden he couldn't begin to imagine. "You asked to meet," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I'm here. Now. Are you going to tell me what's going on?" She took a deep breath, her eyes flickering away for a moment before locking back onto his. "I don't have much time, and you probably won't understand everything right now. But I need you to trust me. At least for now." "Trust you?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Sienna, you left me at the altar. You disappeared for 5 years. Now you show up out of nowhere with a child. And you want me to trust you? She narrowed her eyes but didn't respond immediately. Instead, she opened her bag and pulled out a thick envelope, placing it on the table between them. "Read this," she said, sliding the envelope toward him. "It will answer some questions. Not all, but the ones that matter right now." Ethan stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. "Why don't you just tell me what's going on? Why did you disappear? Why are you back now?" "Because I don't have a choice," she said, her voice low but loaded with emotion. "Because the people you're dealing with, Ethan, you have no idea what they're capable of." He frowned. "What are you talking about? Who are these people?" She glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone might overhear. "Just read it, and don't try to find me after this. For everyone's sake." Before he could respond, Sienna stood up. "Wait." He grabbed her wrist, meeting her eyes. "That little girl." She froze for a second but quickly pulled her arm away. "Goodbye, Ethan." And with that, she left, disappearing through the door as quickly as she had entered. Ethan sat there, staring at the envelope on the table. His heart pounded, and he knew he was about to open more than just a stack of papers. He was about to open a door to the past, and to something he sensed would change everything once again. Ethan stared at the envelope as if it were a wild animal ready to attack. The cafe around him felt distant. The clinking of cups, occasional laughter, and the faint whispers of background music sounded like echoes from another world. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the envelope and carefully opened it, pulling out a thick stack of papers. His eyes skimmed the first pages, and as he read, a growing sense of unease churned in his stomach. The documents were meticulously organized. There were financial spreadsheets, printed emails, signed contracts, and even photographs. The information pointed to something impossible to ignore. Victor Calloway, the man who had been his business partner and someone he considered a close friend, was deeply involved in a large-scale corruption scheme. Victor had used his connections with Lockwood Enterprises to siphon funds from philanthropic projects into offshore accounts. Among the evidence were details about inflated contracts, illegal payments, and even bribes to local politicians. Ethan's hand gripped one of the pages, his fingers tightening. He remembered the projects listed in the documents. At the time, it seemed like Victor was expanding operations in partnership with the company, taking on a larger share of responsibilities for initiatives Ethan didn't have time to oversee personally. But now he could see the truth behind the facade. He continued flipping through the papers until something caught his attention. Amid the evidence was a handwritten note, and signed, but the handwriting looked familiar. "If I keep investigating, they said they'll come after me. I can't take that risk." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. He knew Sienna had written that note. Suddenly, everything started to make sense, or at least part of it. Sienna's abrupt disappearance, the urgency in their meeting at the park, and her expression at the cafe. She had uncovered Victor's scheme before the wedding and had been forced to flee because of it. But why? Why hadn't she told him? Why hadn't she asked for help? Ethan closed his eyes, trying to organize his thoughts. The only explanation was that she believed he was involved too. The thought disgusted him, but at the same time it created a cruel paradox. If Sienna had known Victor was dangerous, it made sense that she would want to protect Ethan, even if it meant destroying everything they had. He opened his eyes again, returning to the pages. Among the evidence, something even more disturbing appeared. An email in which Victor explicitly mentioned Ethan's name. "We need to use Lockwood as the front. He's distracted with the wedding. He won't notice what we're doing." Anger rose in him like a violent tide. Victor had exploited Ethan's trust to cover up his crimes, and now everything Ethan represented was at risk. If this were exposed, the reputation of Lockwood Enterprises would be destroyed, along with the life he had built with Grace and Lauren. And above all, Sienna had paid the highest price. "Bastard," Ethan muttered. His fist clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He grabbed the envelope, carefully placing the papers back inside, and stood from the table. His mind was clear now. He had to confront Victor. There was no other choice. But as he walked out of the cafe, one question lingered. If Sienna had held onto this information for so long, why had she chosen to share it now? The answer seemed obvious. She was cornered. Maybe she was being threatened again, or perhaps she simply couldn't carry the burden any longer. Either way, Ethan knew she hadn't told him everything, and he was determined to uncover the rest and make Victor Calloway pay for what he had done. The documents were spread across Ethan's desk, which was cluttered with papers and frantic notes. The clock on the wall read 2 a.m., but he had no idea how long he had been poring over the details. His focus was locked on every line, every figure, every email Victor had sent or received. He took a sip of cold coffee, ignoring the bitter taste that reminded him of how far he was from the rest of his life at that moment. Victor wasn't just a dishonest partner. He was meticulous, cunning, and had built a scheme so intricate it was almost admirable. Almost. Ethan scribbled a few notes on a pad beside him. He had spent the past few days reading about corporate fraud laws, similar scandals, and legal strategies that could be used to take Victor down. Confronting him directly would be futile. Victor was a skilled manipulator who could easily turn the situation against him. Stay calm, Ethan murmured to himself, leaning back in his chair. I need to stay calm, calculated. He knew it meant acting with surgical precision, gathering irrefutable evidence, forming the right alliances, and, above all, ensuring that Victor was exposed publicly before he had a chance to retaliate. But one thing he couldn't shake. Why had Victor used him so openly? Trust? The distraction of the wedding? Or was there something more? Sienna knew. She had to know. Don't come looking for me after this. Her words echoed in his mind. He knew it was a command to stay away, but the thought of not getting more answers consumed him. Meanwhile, in the other room, Grace stirred awake. The soft glow of the bedside lamp illuminated the empty bed. She reached out to the space beside her, but the spot where Ethan should have been was cold. Grace got up, wrapping a robe around herself before walking toward the office. It was the third consecutive night she'd woken up alone. When she opened the door, she found Ethan hunched over the desk, his eyes glued to the papers in front of him. "You're still at this?" she asked, crossing her arms. Her voice was calm, but there was a clear note of concern. Ethan flinched, looking up. He looked exhausted, his eyes red and sunken. "Sorry," he said quickly. I'm dealing with some work issues. This is more than work." "Ethan," she said, stepping closer. "You've barely slept these past few days. You've barely talked to me or Lauren." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I know. I just need to sort this out." "Sort what out?" Grace pressed. "What's consuming you like this?" Ethan hesitated. He couldn't tell her the truth. Not now, not while everything was still so uncertain. "It's a business problem. Something involving an old contract," he said, avoiding her gaze. Grace studied him for a moment, her eyes scanning his every expression. She knew when Ethan was being evasive, but she chose not to push him further, at least for now. "You can't lose yourself in this," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Lauren and I need you too." He nodded but didn't respond. Grace sighed and stepped back. "Come to bed, Ethan. Even if it's just for a few hours." "I will," he promised, though he knew it was a lie. Grace lingered for another moment before leaving, closing the door softly behind her. When the sound of Grace's footsteps faded, Ethan let out a heavy sigh. He knew he was pulling away from her, but he couldn't help it. The obsession with the truth, with vengeance against Victor, consumed every part of him. He needed a plan, a perfect plan, and that meant sacrificing, at least temporarily, the stability he had worked so hard to build. He looked at the papers again. Every line was a piece of the puzzle, and he was determined to assemble it before Victor even realized something was wrong. "Stay cold," Ethan repeated to himself, his jaw tightening. But deep down, he knew that the coldness he was trying to embrace came at a cost, and he was beginning to fear that the price might be too high. The silence in the apartment was stifling. Grace sat at the kitchen table, her gaze fixed on an envelope in front of her. The investigation she had commissioned revealed far more than she had expected, and she didn't know whether she felt more hurt or afraid. The past few weeks had tested her patience. Ethan was emotionally absent, blatantly lying to her. The man who used to share everything with her now felt like a stranger. And Grace wasn't the type to stay in the dark. The investigator had been clear. Lockwood Enterprises was entangled in a large-scale corruption scheme. And although Ethan's name hadn't yet been directly tied to any wrongdoing, he was clearly involved in something dangerous. She gripped the envelope, her fingers trembling. The man she married, the father of her child, was involved in something dark. And worse, he was hiding it from her. The sound of the front door opening broke her train of thought. Grace glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Ethan walked in, carrying the same exhausted and distracted look that had become his trademark in recent weeks. "You're still up?" he asked, stopping when he saw her sitting at the table. Grace didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, her face calm but her eyes glowing with something he couldn't decipher. "We need to talk," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. Ethan hesitated but obeyed. He draped his jacket over the back of the chair and sat down, looking uncomfortable with the tension in the air. "What's going on, Grace?" he asked, his voice low, trying to sound casual. She pushed the envelope toward him without saying a word. Ethan frowned, picking it up and pulling out the papers. His eyes quickly scanned the contents, and he felt the blood drain from his face. "You hired an investigator?" he asked finally, his tone a mix of shock and disbelief. "I didn't have a choice," she said firmly. "You've been lying to me, Ethan. For weeks. Maybe months." "Grace, he tried to interrupt, but she raised a hand, demanding silence. "I'm not finished," she said, her eyes locked on his. "What I found was enough to connect the dots. There's a corruption scheme happening at Lockwood Enterprises. People are embezzling money, bribing politicians. And you're in the middle of it, Ethan." "That's not true," he said quickly, placing the papers back on the table. "Then tell me what is true," she shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Because if you don't explain yourself right now, I'll go to the police." The air around him felt heavy. Ethan knew Grace wasn't bluffing. She wasn't the type to make empty threats. He averted his gaze, running his hands over his face as he tried to find the right words. "It's not what you think," he began finally. "Then tell me what it is," she demanded. He looked at her, seeing the determination in Grace's eyes. She deserved the truth even if it meant risking everything. "Victor Calloway," he said gravely. "It's him. He's behind the scheme." Grace blinked, confused. "Your partner? Why?" "He used Lockwood as a front," Ethan explained, trying to keep his voice steady. "While I was distracted with the wedding, he manipulated contracts, embezzled funds, and bribed people. I didn't know at the time. I only found out now." Grace crossed her arms, skeptical. "And why didn't you go to the police immediately?" "Because it's not that simple, Grace," Ethan replied, frustration creeping into his tone. "The evidence I have isn't enough to protect us. He's clever, he knows how to twist the narrative in his favor. If I go after him without a plan, he'll destroy Lockwood and ruin our lives in the process." Grace shook her head in disbelief. "You knew this and didn't tell me? I'm your wife, Ethan. How could you hide this from me?" "I was trying to protect you," he said, his voice low. "You and Lauren. Protect us?" Grace let out a humorless laugh. "By hiding the truth and shutting us out? That's not protection, Ethan. That's selfishness." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He knew she was right. Grace took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "What are you going to do now?" Ethan looked at her, his resolve hardening. "I'm going to take Victor down. But I need to do it the right way. That means staying calm, gathering enough evidence to ensure he never gets back up once he falls." She stared at him for a long moment, analyzing every word, every expression. Finally, Grace sighed. "I'll give you time, Ethan," she said, her tone still firm. "But if I see you putting our family at risk, I'll go to the police myself." Ethan nodded. "Understood." When Grace left the kitchen, Ethan felt the weight of the situation settle over him again. He knew he couldn't fail, not with Victor and certainly not with Grace. The margin for error was gone. It was all or nothing now. The meeting room at the Department of Justice headquarters was cold and unadorned. Ethan sat in a stiff chair, a thick envelope resting on the table in front of him. Two agents watched him closely while a third flipped through the documents he had brought. "These are compelling pieces of evidence," one of the agents said finally, adjusting his glasses. "But they're not enough for a formal indictment. Calloway is smart. He'll argue you're trying to frame him for something you didn't know about." Ethan took a deep breath, maintaining the calm he had been practicing since the moment he decided to bring the evidence to the authorities. He knew this wouldn't be easy. "So, what do you need to make it sufficient?" Ethan asked, clasping his hands on the table. The agent with the glasses leaned back in his chair. "Testimonies. Audio or video recordings. Something that directly connects Calloway to the schemes. Without that, we're dealing with documents he could claim were manipulated. And if I can get that?" Ethan said, his voice low but filled with determination. The agent frowned. "Are you willing to take that kind of risk, Mr. Lockwood?" Ethan nodded. "He used my company, destroyed my reputation, and nearly ruined my life. I'm not letting this go." The agents exchanged glances before agreeing. "If you're willing to collaborate, we can provide equipment and instructions. But you'll need to be extremely careful. Calloway is dangerous, and he won't hesitate to retaliate if he suspects anything." Later that night, Ethan explained the plan to Grace. She listened intently, her arms crossed and her face unreadable. When he finished, she was silent for a moment. "You want to invite him into our home?" she asked incredulously. "It's the only place where I can control the environment," Ethan replied. "If the dinner happens here, we can set up the bugs and record everything. He'll feel comfortable, let his guard down." Grace shook her head, clearly uneasy. "This is too risky. What if he suspects something?" "That's why I need you with me on this," Ethan said, stepping closer to her. "If we act natural, he won't have any reason to suspect. He thinks I'm just another pawn in his game. I'm going to use that against him." Grace stared at him for a long moment before sighing. "Fine. But if anything goes wrong, you're the one dealing with the consequences." Ethan nodded, grateful for her trust. The following night, as Grace prepared dinner, the agents discreetly installed bugs and hidden cameras in strategic spots around the living room and dining area. The atmosphere was set to feel normal, welcoming, just as it should, to avoid raising suspicion. Victor arrived promptly at 8, carrying an expensive bottle of wine and wearing the same arrogant smile Ethan had always hated but learned to tolerate. "Ethan, Grace, it's a pleasure to be here," Victor said, shaking Ethan's hand and giving Grace a light peck on the cheek. "A relaxed dinner is just what I needed. I'm glad you could make it," Ethan replied with a warm but insincere smile. They settled into the living room, where Ethan began pouring generous servings of whiskey for Victor. He kept the conversation light, discussing investments, business, and travel, while Grace played the perfect hostess. As the evening progressed, Victor grew more relaxed, laughing and drinking more than he should. "So, Ethan," Victor began, leaning forward with a conspiratorial grin, "how are things at Lockwood? I hope you haven't been swayed by all that chatter about business ethics." Ethan chuckled, pouring Victor another drink. "Well, Victor, you know how it is. Sometimes the traditional way doesn't bring the results we're looking for." Victor raised his eyebrows, clearly intrigued. "Now that sounds like someone who's finally learning." Ethan leaned closer, lowering his voice as if to share a secret. "I'll be honest with you. I've been thinking a lot about diversifying our operations. Maybe exploring opportunities off the radar." Victor grinned, clearly pleased. He leaned back in his chair, holding his glass. "Now you're speaking my language. Tell me, Ethan, what kind of opportunities do you have in mind?" Ethan gave a cautious glance, as if testing the waters. "Let's just say I'm open to something less conventional. And who better to guide me in that than you?" Victor laughed loudly. "Ah, Ethan, I knew you were more than the straight-laced boy everyone thinks you are. Look, those inflated contracts we handled a few years back? Brilliant. The money flowed exactly where we needed it, and no one suspected a thing. If we do it right, we can expand even further." Ethan kept his expression neutral, though his heart was racing. Every word from Victor was a direct confession, and he knew it was all being captured by the bugs. "Interesting," Ethan said, pretending to consider. Maybe you could show me the details of how that worked. Just so I know exactly what I'd be getting into. Victor nodded, laughing again. No problem, my friend. You'll see how easy it is. You just have to know how to play the game. When Victor finally left, slightly unsteady as he walked out the door, Ethan closed it and leaned against it, letting out a long sigh. Grace entered the room, arms crossed. Did we get it? Ethan nodded, glancing at the discreetly placed devices. Yes, he gave us everything. Now, it was only a matter of time before Victor Calloway would be brought down. The chime of the doorbell echoed through Victor Calloway's office the next morning, a sound as ordinary as any other business day. He looked up from the financial report on his computer screen and muttered a disinterested, "Come in." The door opened, but it wasn't his assistant who entered. It was two federal agents, accompanied by a justice officer. "Victor Calloway?" one of the agents asked, his tone firm and authoritative. Victor stood slowly, frowning. "Yes. What's this about?" The agent stepped forward, pulling out a warrant. "You are under arrest on suspicion of corporate fraud, bribery, and embezzlement. Please place your hands where we can see them." Victor froze, his expression shifting to one of disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he exclaimed, trying to maintain composure. "You have nothing on me. We have sufficient evidence for a warrant and to open a formal investigation," the agent replied calmly. As Victor protested, claiming innocence, the agents began confiscating documents and electronic devices from the office. The scene quickly descended into chaos, with employees watching in stunned silence as the man who ran the company was handcuffed and escorted out. Across town, Ethan sat in his living room, watching the live broadcast of Victor's arrest on TV. His emotions were mixed. Relief at finally exposing the culprit and frustration over all the chaos he had allowed Victor to cause. Grace sat beside him, holding his hand. "He's finished," she said, her tone a blend of satisfaction and exhaustion. "I hope now you can focus more on us." "On Lauren." "I promise I will," Ethan replied, trying to sound sincere. Later, alone in his office, Ethan picked up his phone and typed a brief message to Sienna. "Victor was arrested. Thank you for the evidence. Now we need to talk." He stared at the message for a moment before sending it. Seconds later, a response came. "Tonight, 9 p.m. warehouse on Wabash. Come alone." Ethan took a deep breath, pocketing the phone. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, not just because of Sienna but because he was keeping this from Grace. He had promised himself he would protect his family. But to do that, he first needed to face the ghost of his past. The warehouse on Wabash was ominous, a rusted metal structure surrounded by shadows that seemed to swallow the empty street. Ethan parked his car and walked to the entrance, his footsteps echoing against the concrete ground. He was ready for a confrontation, fueled by the anger that had been building since he first saw Sienna in the park. When he stepped inside, he saw Sienna standing near a pile of crates. She looked even more worn under the dim light that illuminated the space. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was a mix of guilt and resolve. "You came," she said flatly. Ethan stopped a few steps away, his gaze fixed on her. "You called me. Now talk. Why did you do this, Sienna? Why did you disappear? And more importantly, why are you back now?" She hesitated, running a hand through the messy bun atop her head. "I didn't have a choice," she began quietly. "Back then, I was threatened." "Victor," Ethan said immediately. Sienna nodded. "Yes, I found out about his scheme right before the wedding. He knew I was investigating and he made threats. He said if I told you anything, he wouldn't hesitate to destroy me." "To destroy you?" Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "So you just ran? Left everything behind? Left me at the altar without a word? Do you think it was easy for me?" She snapped, her voice rising. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was protecting—" She stopped, but it was too late. "Protecting who?" Ethan asked, his voice growing firmer. Sienna looked away, taking a deep breath before answering. "Sophia." The name hit Ethan like a thunderclap. His stomach churned. "She's mine, isn't she?" He stepped closer, his eyes blazing with an intensity that made Sienna take a slight step back. Sienna hesitated again but knew she couldn't lie anymore. Yes, she admitted finally. Sophia is your daughter. The confirmation hit Ethan like a punch. He ran a hand over his face, trying to process the revelation. You knew the whole time, and you kept me in the dark for 5 years. I couldn't risk it, she said, her voice trembling. If Victor found out, he would have used it against us. Against her. I did what I thought was right. Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound filled with disbelief. What was right? You took away my chance to know my own daughter, to be there for her. That's what you call right? Sienna closed her eyes, trying to hold back tears. I know I was wrong, but it wasn't just about you, Ethan. It was about keeping her safe. For a moment, silence filled the warehouse. Ethan paced back and forth, his mind spinning with anger, pain, and the need to act. He thought about Lauren, the stability he'd built with Grace, and now Sophia, a daughter he hadn't even known existed. I want to meet her, he said finally, his voice firm. Sienna stared at him, surprised. Ethan, no, he interrupted, raising a hand. There's no excuse you can give me to deny this. I have the right to meet her, and she has the right to know me. Sienna swallowed hard, knowing he was right. She doesn't know who you are, she said, trying to keep her nerves in check. I've never told her about you. Then start talking, Ethan said, his expression serious. Because that's going to change. Sienna sighed in defeat. I'll think about how to do it. But Ethan, be patient. Sophia is everything to me. I can't let anything hurt her. I don't want to hurt her, Ethan said, his tone softening. I want to be part of her life. And Sienna, I will be. With or without your help. Sienna lowered her gaze, knowing Ethan wouldn't back down. As he left the warehouse, his mind was conflicted. He knew the anger he felt toward Sienna wouldn't fade anytime soon. But now, something stronger was driving him. The desire to meet Sophia and reclaim the years he had lost. And deep down, he knew this would change his life forever. The living room was bathed in the warm light of the late afternoon when Ethan walked in, carefully closing the door behind him. Grace was in the kitchen, slicing fruit for Lauren, who was playing with a puzzle in the living room. It was such an ordinary, peaceful scene that, for a moment, Ethan hesitated, the weight of what he needed to say catching in his throat. Grace, he called softly. She looked up, noticing the seriousness in his expression. Drying her hands on a dish towel, she walked over to him. Did something happen? Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. Yes, and I need to tell you everything. Her brow furrowed in concern, but she gestured for him to continue. I'm listening. Ethan glanced briefly at Lauren, who was engrossed in the colorful puzzle pieces. He motioned toward the office where they could have some privacy. Grace followed, closing the door behind her. Once they sat down, Ethan began to speak. He told her about the unexpected encounter with Sienna in the park, the cryptic note, Victor's scheme, and finally, the revelation that Sophia was his daughter. The words came out in a rush, and Grace's expression shifted from surprise to disbelief, and finally to something softer, understanding. When he finished, silence lingered between them for a moment. So, you have another daughter, Grace said slowly, as if processing the words as she spoke them. Ethan nodded hesitantly. Yes, I didn't know, Grace. I had no idea. And if I had known, I never would have hidden it from you or Lauren. Grace crossed her arms, her gaze intense. And what do you want to do now? I want to be part of her life, Ethan replied without hesitation. I want Sophia to meet Lauren. To meet you. I want to fix what's been broken for so long. Grace sighed, lowering her gaze for a moment. This is a lot to process. But I understand. She looked at him again, and there was something in her eyes that reassured him. Ethan, I know you never wanted this to happen this way, and I know it's important to you. So, if you think this is the right thing to do, I'll support you. Relief flooded over him, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Thank you, he murmured, taking her hand. But, she added firmly, we need to do this together. Lauren will need time to understand. And I need to meet Sienna before anything else happens. Ethan nodded, agreeing. Together, a few weeks later, Ethan, Sienna, and Sophia met at a park, this time intentionally. Sophia, initially shy, clung tightly to her mother's hand as they approached Ethan. "Hi, Sophia," he said, kneeling to her level. The little girl looked at him curiously, her big brown eyes filled with uncertainty. "Hi," she whispered softly. Sienna gave her daughter an encouraging smile. "This is Ethan. He's someone special." Sophia glanced at him again, and after a few seconds of hesitation, she gave a small smile. Ethan felt his heart warm. "Would you like to play with my other daughter, Lauren?" he asked, pointing to where Lauren was swinging at the playground with Grace nearby. Sophia nodded, looking to Sienna for permission. When Sienna gave a small nod of approval, Sophia released her mother's hand and walked slowly toward the swings. Grace smiled warmly at Sophia and helped her into a swing beside Lauren. It didn't take long before the two girls were laughing together, sharing stories about their favorite toys. Ethan watched from a distance, his heart full. He felt Sienna step closer, and the two stood side by side for a moment, watching the girls. "She looks happy," he said, referring to Sophia. "She is," Sienna replied softly. "And I think she's going to be even happier now." Ethan looked at her, the tension that had once existed between them beginning to fade. "Thank you for allowing this. I know it wasn't easy for you." "It was the right thing to do," Sienna said with a faint smile. In the months that followed, Sophia's visits became more frequent, and she quickly formed a strong bond with Lauren. The two girls were inseparable when they were together, their laughter filling the house with a joy Ethan hadn't realized he needed. True to her word, Grace embraced Sophia as part of the family. She and Sienna maintained a respectful relationship, both focused on the well-being of their children. Ethan, for his part, felt whole. For the first time in years, he had everything he'd ever wanted. A united family, a balanced life, and a future filled with possibilities. As he watched Lauren and Sophia running through the yard, playing as if they'd been sisters all along, he realized he had found genuine happiness. The past had finally stopped being a burden, becoming instead a part of the story that had led him to this moment. Sienna sat at her new desk, surrounded by papers and a computer that still felt unfamiliar. The office was small but organized, with a calm atmosphere. Returning to work after years of uncertainty felt bittersweet, like she was finally rebuilding the parts of herself that had been left behind. The job, at a consulting firm run by an old family friend of Ethan's, was an unexpected gesture of support. When Ethan mentioned the opportunity, she hesitated to accept, worried it might make her dependent on him again. But the need for stability for Sophia and the desire to regain her independence convinced her to say yes. "Settling in well?" Peter, the firm's director, asked as he passed by her desk. He was a kind man with gray hair and a warm smile that made her feel at ease. "Yes," Sienna replied, returning the smile. "It's good to be back in a routine." Peter nodded. "You're doing great. I'm sure you'll be a tremendous asset to us." She thanked him and returned to her work, organizing reports and participating in occasional meetings. Each day she felt more secure, more confident. While her relationship with Ethan and her connection with Sophia and Lauren remained priorities, Sienna knew this job was a key piece in finding her place in the world again. It was a new beginning, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that a stable, peaceful future was possible. Ethan was sitting on the living room couch with Lauren on one side and Sophia on the other, both holding colorful books they insisted on showing him at the same time. "Daddy, look at this one," Lauren exclaimed excitedly, pointing at a drawing of a red dragon breathing fire. "No, look at this. It's cooler," Sophia interjected, showing a page with a sparkling unicorn. Ethan laughed, a light and genuine sound that had felt rare just a few months ago. All right, girls, one at a time. Dragons first, then unicorns. Fair is fair." The girls erupted into laughter, a harmony so natural it warmed his heart every time he saw them together. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, and Ethan knew that nothing, not even the complications of the past, could take away the happiness he felt now. He glanced toward the kitchen door, where Grace stood leaning against the frame, watching the scene with a serene smile. Their eyes met, and Ethan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. In the past few months, he had fallen in love all over again. Not with something new, but with what had always been there, Grace, with her strength, her patience, her ability to forgive, and her unwavering belief in him, even when he doubted himself. Later that night, after the girls were tucked into bed, Ethan found Grace on the balcony, a glass of wine in her hand and her gaze lost in the lights of Chicago. He walked up behind her and wrapped her in an embrace. "You're thoughtful," he remarked, his voice low and gentle. Grace smiled, leaning her head against his chest. "I was just thinking about how much things have changed, and how good we are now." "We are," he agreed, holding her a little tighter. "Thanks to you." Grace chuckled softly, turning to face him. "Thanks to me? You're the one who held all of this together, Ethan. You fought for us." Ethan shook his head, his eyes shining. "I fought because you gave me a reason to fight. Because you stayed by my side when I didn't deserve it." Grace cupped his face, her smile tender and loving. "You've always deserved it, Ethan. Always." He kissed her, a gesture full of gratitude and love. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the scars of the past beginning to heal. He was no longer a man trapped by a moment of abandonment and pain. He was a man who had found a family, a home, and a purpose. In that moment, with the city lights twinkling in the background and Grace in his arms, Ethan knew that despite all the hardships, he deeply loved the life he had built. The dinner table was set as always. Candles lit, plates carefully arranged, and a bottle of red wine thoughtfully chosen by Ethan. It was an evening he imagined would be like any other. A time for the family to come together, talk, and unwind. Lauren and Sophia had already eaten and were in the living room, laughing at a cartoon. Grace and Ethan were alone at the table, the atmosphere warm and cozy. But there was something about Grace that he couldn't ignore. She was too quiet, pushing her food around on her plate without really eating, her eyes avoiding his. "Is everything okay, Grace?" Ethan asked at last. She took a deep breath, placing her utensils down on the plate and looking at him. Her eyes were bright, not with anger or sadness, but with a determination he didn't recognize. "Ethan," she began, her voice firm but quiet, "I need to tell you something important, something I've been holding on to for a long time." He frowned, feeling a growing unease. "What is it?" Grace clasped her hands on the table, staring at them for a moment before meeting his gaze. "I can't keep doing this with us." Ethan's world came to a halt. He blinked, as if he had misheard her. "What are you saying?" Grace swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. "I've met someone, and I want a divorce." The word fell between them like a bomb. Ethan froze, trying to process what he'd just heard. His mind spun, but he couldn't find the words. "Someone else?" he finally asked, his voice distant even to himself. Grace nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and resolution. "It's not about him, Ethan. It's about me. About us. I just can't do this anymore." Ethan shook his head, confused and hurt. "But why? We're fine. We have a beautiful family. What happened?" She looked at him, tears threatening to spill. "You don't understand, Ethan. No matter how hard I've tried, no matter how much I've accepted Sophia, no matter how much I love you in our life, I can't deal with this. Not internally." He frowned, the pain rising. "Deal with what? Sophia? Grace, she's just a child. She didn't ask to be in this situation. And you're amazing with her. And I will continue to be," Grace said quickly. "I would never do anything to hurt her. But this isn't about her. It's about me. I imagined my life, our family, in such a perfect, traditional way. And then suddenly it changed. And no matter how much I've accepted it on the surface, inside, Ethan, I couldn't." She took a deep breath, wiping away a tear. "I'm a perfectionist. I know that. I always have been. I wanted a stable, predictable future. And when that changed, something inside me broke. And I couldn't fix it." "Grace, we can work through this," Ethan said desperately. "We can get help, therapy, anything. Don't throw everything away over some idea of perfection that no one achieves. She shook her head, her expression sad but resolute. It's not just that. It's deeper. And it's not fair to you. I've already distanced myself from you, Ethan. My heart is somewhere else now. He looked away, feeling the weight of her words. Grace had always been the person he could count on, his anchor. And now she was saying goodbye. Do you really want this? He asked, his voice low, trying to hide the tremor. Grace nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. Yes, it's what's best for both of us. And for the girls. He sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the wine in his glass. Then slowly he nodded. If this is what you want, he said, his voice cold and controlled, then I won't stop you. Grace wiped her tears and stood from the table. She paused for a moment, looking at him with something that seemed like regret. Ethan, you're an incredible man, and I hope you find someone who can give you what I couldn't. He didn't respond. He just sat there, alone at the table, listening to her footsteps fade and the distant laughter of Lauren and Sophia in the living room. That night, after the girls were asleep, Ethan sat in his office, staring at nothing. The pain was unbearable, but deep down, he knew Grace was being honest. And as much as it hurt, he knew he had to accept it. Ethan's office was steeped in oppressive silence, interrupted only by the constant sound of typing and the occasional click of the mouse. Piles of documents covered the desk, along with project folders that seemed to multiply by the day. He had arrived there at 6 in the morning, and now, nearly 10 at night, he still hadn't stopped working. He leaned back in his chair, massaging his temples as he stared at the numbers on the screen before him. The graphs and reports had become his constant companions, a nearly welcome distraction from the storm raging inside him. Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the brutal irony of his life. Sienna had abandoned him at the altar, leaving behind only a note and a void that had taken years to heal. Grace, the woman who had helped him rebuild his life, had now betrayed him and left, shattering what he believed to be stability. He harbored resentment toward them both. As much as he understood, deep down, their motivations, it didn't lessen the pain. Sienna had run away with his daughter, robbing him of Sophia's early years. He had forgiven her, or at least he thought he had, but now, with Grace's departure, everything seemed to resurface, like a wound that had never truly healed. And Grace, she had been his anchor, the woman who stood by him through chaos, who embraced Sophia and seemed willing to build a life together. Yet she had left him too, not because he didn't love her enough, but because she couldn't accept the life they had. Ethan hit the sleep button on the keyboard, letting the screen go dark. His reflection appeared in the black monitor, and he barely recognized the man staring back at him. You're a failure, he thought bitterly. 2 women, 2 losses, and a lifetime of instability. He shook his head, trying to push the thought away, and returned to his work. It wasn't a solution, but it was all he had. The days began to follow the same pattern. Ethan woke up before dawn, grabbed a quick coffee, and headed straight to the office. He filled every minute with meetings, reports, and decisions, refusing to allow a moment of stillness. The few moments he spent with Sophia and Lauren were brief, almost formal. He saw them on weekends or picked them up from school, but even during those times, his mind was elsewhere. Daddy, Lauren called one time, tugging at his shirt sleeve while he was on the phone. Are you listening? Ethan knelt and kissed her forehead, forcing a smile. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm here. What is it? But he knew he wasn't really there. The nights were the hardest. He came home exhausted but unable to sleep. The ghosts of Sienna and Grace haunted him, their voices blending into a cacophony of regrets and unanswered questions. He remembered moments with Grace. Laughter, family dinners, the way she held his hand when he doubted himself. And he remembered Sienna, her smile, the plans they had made before everything fell apart. But in the end, all that remained was him. One night, he picked up his phone and almost sent messages to both women. Something bitter and accusatory to Grace. Something confused and full of anger to Sienna. But he didn't. He knew it wouldn't change anything. Instead, he walked into the living room, grabbed a bottle of whiskey, and sat on the couch, staring into the void. Work is enough, he told himself. Work is all that matters now. But deep down, Ethan knew he was only running. Running from the pain, the emptiness, and the fact that, for the second time, the stability he craved so desperately had crumbled to dust. It was another ordinary day at the office. The cold light of the computer screen illuminated Ethan's tired face as he typed furiously, immersed in yet another financial report that had no real urgency. He paused for a moment, rubbing his temples. A thought passed through his mind, so sudden that he froze. Sienna. Since bringing her back into his life for Sophia's sake, there had been a hole in the narrative he had never tried to fill. Where had she been? What had happened during the 5 years she disappeared without a trace? He had accepted her superficial explanations about protecting Sophia and fleeing Victor's threats, but he had never looked deeper. It was as if he had been afraid to ask. But in that moment, something shifted. He needed to know. Ethan picked up his phone and sent a brief message. Sienna, can we talk? It's important. The response came almost immediately. This afternoon, 3 p.m., my place. At 3 o'clock, Ethan parked in front of Sienna's small apartment in a modest Chicago neighborhood. The building was simple and clean, but far from the luxury she had once known. She opened the door before he could knock. There was hesitation in her eyes, but she gestured for him to come in. Why do you want to talk? She asked, walking to the small dining table and motioning for him to sit. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. I never asked where you were. What happened during those 5 years? I guess I always assumed you were safe. But looking at things now, it doesn't seem like that was the case. Sienna leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. For a moment, he thought she might refuse to answer. But finally, she sighed and began to speak, her voice low and heavy with emotion. After I ran, I had nowhere to go, she started. Victor had threatened me, and I knew that if I stayed in Chicago, he would find a way to silence me. So I left. I got on the first bus I could find. Not even knowing where I was headed, she paused, looking down at her hands. I went hungry, more than you can imagine. I moved from place to place, relying on the kindness of strangers when I was lucky, or sleeping on the street when I wasn't. Ethan felt his chest tighten. He tried to picture Sienna, the woman who had once stood beside him, surrounded by comfort and security, living like that. But the image was unbearable. And when I found out I was pregnant with Sophia, she continued, I didn't know what to do. I had no money, no one to turn to. I thought about going back to you, but what would happen if Victor found out? He knew how to find me. He would have destroyed you, and I couldn't risk that. She paused for a moment, tears beginning to stream down her face. There were times I thought I wouldn't make it, that I wouldn't be able to protect Sophia. I worked in diners, in stores, anything that paid enough to buy food for her. And sometimes, even that wasn't enough. Ethan didn't say anything. He just stared at her, the guilt and shock building inside him. Sienna wiped her tears quickly, straightening in her chair. But I made it. I don't know how, but I did. And despite everything, Sophia was always my strength. She gave me a reason to keep going, even when it felt impossible. She looked directly at him, her eyes glistening with emotion. You ask where I've been, Ethan. I've been surviving. For her. For me. And, in a way, for you too. The words hung in the air, heavy with weight and truth. Ethan ran his hands over his face, trying to process what she had just told him. He felt crushed by the sheer weight of the story he had never imagined hearing. Back at his office, the graphs and reports in front of him were just blurs, the words and numbers incapable of holding his focus as they usually did. He tried to concentrate, to push away the weight that had been placed on his shoulders after the conversation with Sienna. But he couldn't. Her words echoed in his mind. I've been surviving. For her. For me. And, in a way, for you too. Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. A wave of guilt crashed over him, tightening his chest almost unbearably. For so long, he had viewed being left at the altar as the worst thing that had ever happened to him. The public humiliation, the trauma of being abandoned without explanation, the void it had created in his life. all of it had felt insurmountable. He had built that moment into a pillar of his pain and anger. But now all of it felt small, ridiculous even. He had thought of Sienna as someone who simply left him, who ran when he needed her most. Never, not even for a moment, had he allowed himself to consider what she might have endured. Sleeping on the street, going hungry, fighting off real threats while carrying a child she didn't have the resources to care for. All of it while protecting him, Ethan, from an enemy he hadn't even known existed. And all I ever thought about was myself, Ethan reflected, the shame consuming him. The night was cold as Ethan parked in front of Sienna's apartment. He turned off the engine but remained seated for a moment, staring at the small building that felt warmer and more inviting than any mansion or penthouse he'd ever known. Deep down, he understood that this moment was the most important of his life. It wasn't a negotiation or a strategy. It was a meeting of souls, a desperate attempt to repair what had been broken by years of pain and silence. He took a deep breath, got out of the car, and quickly climbed the stairs. Before he could hesitate, he knocked on the door. Sienna opened it just seconds later, surprise flashing across her face. She was dressed simply in comfortable clothes, her hair tied back haphazardly. But to Ethan, she had never looked more beautiful. "Ethan," she said, clearly confused. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. Sienna hesitated but nodded, stepping aside to let him in. They walked to the small, neatly arranged living room. She sat on the couch, motioning for him to do the same. "What is this about?" she asked cautiously. Ethan bowed his head for a moment, organizing his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was laden with sincerity. "Sienna, I came to ask for your forgiveness," he began. "For years, I carried a deep bitterness. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and I let that define how I saw you. But I was wrong, completely wrong." Sienna's eyes widened, but she didn't interrupt. "After hearing what you went through, everything you faced to protect me and Sophia, I realized something I should have understood a long time ago," Ethan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "What you did was the greatest act of love anyone could do. You sacrificed yourself. You suffered, starved, lost everything, everything. For us. For me." Sienna blinked rapidly, trying to hold back tears. "I have no right to judge your choices," he said, "because while I was stuck in my own pain, you were fighting to survive. And now all the resentment I felt, it's gone. Because, Sienna, what's left is just one thing. The love I feel for you. The love I've always felt." She took a deep breath, her eyes shining. "Ethan, I don't know what to say." "Then just listen," he said, moving closer. "There's nothing I want more in this life than to rebuild everything with you. Not because of Sophia, not because of the past, but because you're the person I've loved the most and still love." He took her hand, looking directly into her eyes. "Please give me a chance to do this together, without fear, without secrets." Sienna let out a soft sob, tears finally falling. For years, she had carried guilt, shame, and the weight of her choices. And now, hearing those words, sincere, free of judgment, felt like an old wound finally healing. She didn't respond with words. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. The kiss was gentle but laden with everything they had lost. The love that had never disappeared, the desire to start over, and the promise of a better future. When they parted, she smiled, still crying. "I love you too, Ethan. I always have." He pulled her close, wrapping her in an embrace that seemed to piece together their broken fragments. In the months that followed, Ethan and Sienna began rebuilding their lives together, this time as equals. Sophia and Lauren grew even closer, their laughter filling the home they now shared as a family. Ethan discovered a peace he had never known. Not because life was perfect, but because he finally understood that true love wasn't about perfection. It was about sacrifice, forgiveness, and choosing to stand by someone, even when things were hard. Sienna, in turn, found strength in knowing she no longer had to carry everything alone. Ethan was there, as she had always hoped, ready to be a father, a partner, and, above all, a man who loved her completely. And so, the past finally stopped being a weight for either of them. The future lay before them, shining with possibilities. Together, they faced it with everything they had.
Hey, listen up. We've just started this channel. If you enjoy the story, make sure to subscribe. We're working on even better ones, so don't miss out. Subscribe to get notified and watch our upcoming videos. Thank you so much for making it this far.